Rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is a Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to spend some time looking at a number of issues this first hour. Second hour, we're going to be talking about a book, The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever, and I think you'll appreciate that conversation next hour. But let's get into some of the issues in the news, and my first article is by Cal Thomas on the worst transition ever, and I was going to get to that right away, but we will too in just a minute, because as you well know, if you've been listening to this program, we've been encouraging you to contact your two United States senators to prevent a shutdown, which will happen by Friday or certainly Saturday morning, however you want to look at that. And that looks like there may be a deal, but in some respects, it isn't exactly what we were looking for. And that is, yesterday we have congressional leaders that unveiled what they call a bipartisan deal to actually just move the shutdown deadline from December 20th to March 14th. Oh, thank you so much. Well, in some respects, even the Republicans wanted that. So rather than extend it all the way to the next fiscal year, this would not allow for some of the things that Donald Trump wanted to implement. But as we are so fearful of whenever something gets close to December, it begins to look like a Christmas tree with all sorts of people wanting to put sort of end of the year ornaments on that Christmas tree, and no surprise there. The measure includes $110 billion in disaster relief. First of all, you have to ask the question, don't we have money set aside in other programs for that? Of course, we've talked about on this program that FEMA ran out of money. Maybe that was because they were doing all sorts of things with that money that would have nothing to do with disaster relief, so part of that. But as you might imagine, there's a few other things in there as well. One of the pieces would allow the District of Columbia to take over certain land so they can negotiate with the NFL's Washington Commanders to actually have a stadium which would be closer to District of Columbia. No surprise that some of those things happen. Another $2 billion in there for some small businesses so they can bounce back from natural disasters. $740 million to repair the NASA facilities after the recent hurricanes. You also have legislation that would, for example, green light the year-round sales of gasoline with higher ethanol blends. That's, of course, some kind of sop towards the corn farmers and a few others. $13 million, this one might make some sense, for security for U.S. Supreme Court justices as their residences. And again, a lot of these things you would want to probably say, you know, I thought we had money in the budget for that already, and all we're trying to do is just keep the government's doors open, but we're adding all sorts of things in there as well. And of course, if you are convinced that this is going to blow up the budget, well, the budget's already blown up, and a little bit later we'll get into a very good piece by former member of Congress Jim Hensarling on how Congress is headed for a fiscal cliff. It's one of those articles that I used to do when we were in the election, saying these are some issues, no matter who is elected president, are going to have to address. Well, we know who the president's going to be, and these are some things that that president and, of course, the House of Representatives will have to address as well. To get this passed, you can, of course, still contact your two United States senators because we don't have a deal yet. And more importantly, we wanted to use this shutdown as an opportunity to do two things. Number one, make sure the government didn't run out of funds, but more importantly, also say, isn't it time to have some fiscal responsibility and pass a budget rather than just kick the can down the road till March 14th? So that is still something you might want to contact your two senators about, but you might want to also contact your member of Congress, because Mike Johnson, who is Speaker of the House as a Republican, has a 219 to 211 Republican majority. I am convinced, as I'm going to point out in just a minute, there are probably some Republicans that will vote against it. I might have been one of those, given all the things that have been added to what was supposed to be a simple funding extension. But you know how that gets played in Congress. And so there would be a need for some Democrats. By the way, I might just point out, let's give some credit where credit is due. One very significant Democrat, Rosa DeLauro, who is a representative, who is a Democrat in the House Appropriations Committee, supported the idea of the spending package. So he might have picked up a few Democrats here and there, but it's pretty clear that it is quite possible that Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, will lose some Republicans, and part of that is due to Elon Musk. If you haven't been out on Twitter, not that I recommend it, but if you go out to X, formerly known as Twitter, Elon Musk said, the measure should not pass. This was his way of saying, look, this does not have to be passed. Maybe it's time to shut down the government and really determine what are essential services. And so yesterday, I guess I say, it was actually this morning, actually, I was trying to remember when this took place. There was an interview that the co-host of Fox and Friends, Steve Ducey, actually talked to, of course, the Speaker of the House about this as well, Mike Johnson. Mike Johnson said, well, I've been communicating with Elon last month. Elon, Vivek, and I are on a text chain together, and I was explaining to them the background of this. And Vivek and I talked last night at almost midnight, and he said, look, I get it, and we understand you're in an impossible position. Everyone knows that. And, of course, the point he was making is I have a razor-thin margin of Republicans, so even to pass this stopgap measure, we'll have to have some Democrat votes. So I thought I'd give you the latest here. At first, when I heard that there was an announcement of an agreement, I thought, well, maybe we should pull down our take action item. And then I thought, no, I'm not going to make a phone call or send a text out to anybody on staff here to do that, since I was off yesterday, because Penna Dexter did an outstanding program, because we still don't have a deal. And even if we have a deal, it's maybe not one we really like. And so it brings us back to the fact that, number one, if you have not contacted your two senators or even your member of the House of Representatives, we make it possible for you to contact them about trying to avoid a government shutdown. You can now, of course, amend the letter if you'd like and say, it's one thing to try to keep the government going. It's quite another that you've added a number of ornaments to this year-end Christmas tree spending bill, and maybe it's time to get a real budget. And so I think there's still an opportunity for you to contact your two members of Congress in the Senate. And, of course, if you want to contact one in the House, you can do so as well. That's just a little bit more than I thought we'd be talking about, but as I've dug into this, as you can see that I have, there are just a lot more of those little ornaments on this short-term bill on the year-end Christmas tree to keep it funded till next year. Yeah, March 14th is as far as we can actually get it, the federal government funded. This is not the way to run a government. Let's hope that we get some regular order in Congress. Let's hope, and I think we're starting to see some evidence that maybe we're going to get some grown-ups in the Oval Office and the executive wing and try to deal with some of these issues. But nevertheless, that's where we stand on trying to keep the government going with a stopgap funding bill. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the carol O Come, Emmanuel is an English translation of a Latin hymn that was sung during Advent and Christmas. The text goes back to at least the 18th century and perhaps much earlier, while the music goes back to the 15th century. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. Emmanuel means God with us. Even before the coming of Christ, we see passages in the Old Testament that remind us that God was with Israel. In 1 Kings 8, we read, "Praise the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel, just as he promised. Not one word has failed of all the wonderful promises he gave through his servant Moses. May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our ancestors. May he never leave us or abandon us." In Psalm 46, we read that the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. One of the most visible reminders of God's presence was during the Exodus. God was with the Israelites as a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of smoke by day. His presence was with them in the tabernacle and later in the temple in the Holy of Holies. But the most important aspect of Emmanuel is found in the New Testament. John tells us in his gospel, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." This is the miracle of the incarnation. God put on human flesh and came to Israel so that he might give his life for all of us. Paul writes to Timothy, "Here is the great mystery of our religion. Christ came as a human." This is what we celebrate at Christmas. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, go to one of the columns I've posted by our good friend Cal Thomas, been on the program a number of times over these years, and he refers to this as the worst transition ever. Now, if you were to ask me up until, say, a couple of weeks ago, what was probably the worst transition, and I'll say modern times, we've had a couple of maybe in the 19th century, pretty awful, but in modern times, what was the worst transition? I think, without a doubt, Republicans and Democrats, anybody who knows a little bit about presidential history, would say probably the transition from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush. And there were some reasons for that. First of all, there was an assumption that Al Gore was going to be the president, so he'd have 8 years of Bill Clinton. They thought they'd have 8 years of Al Gore, and I think they didn't assume might even have 8 years of Hillary Clinton after that. I mean, honestly, that was a shock to the system. And then the way in which it happened, by the switch of the votes, if you will, from their perspective in Florida, that as a result, and also the fact there were a lot of, I think, it's fair to say, fairly immature individuals that had served in the Clinton White House, who as a result did all sorts of things. For example, they took some of the keys off of the keyboards on the computers, and they left lots of trash around and didn't really go out of their way to try to help those who were coming in to make themselves comfortable in the Oval Office and the West Wing and those kinds of things. Anyway, bottom line is that was usually considered the worst transition in modern times. I think we would have to agree with Cal Thomas. Now we have, right before our very eyes, the worst transition in modern times, maybe, as he says, the worst transition ever. And remember that Cal Thomas got his name as the fact he was named for Calvin Coolidge, because Cal Thomas's family, his parents, actually had served in the administration of Calvin Coolidge. So when he looks back even further than most of it because of family history. All that to be said, he says the soon-to-expire Biden administration is behaving as if an invading foreign power is about to take over, and the House must be burned down to keep the invaders from succeeding. And he talks about how the cynicism meter has ticked up rather dramatically for a number of reasons. First came the pardons of Hunter Biden, and then roughly 1,500 other individuals. He gives you a few examples, and I'll only pick out maybe two. One is the former judge in the state of Pennsylvania who used his private jail system to incarcerate juveniles, pocketing the profits. That one's pretty awful. Then he talks about another one, which is Rita Crudwell, former comptroller of Dixon, Illinois, who was convicted in 2013 and sentenced to nearly 20 years in prison for stealing over 2 decades, almost $54 million from the town of about 15,000 people. It's most people believe it's probably the largest municipal fraud in U.S. history. And she, now 71, admitted to embezzling the city and used the stolen funds to support her lavish lifestyle. And the officials recovered only about 40 million of that. You got to wonder where the other is hidden in some way or another. And so these are just a few of the individuals that have been actually pardoned by, of course, Joe Biden. So that's the first issue. Cal Thomas points to all these pardons. And, of course, that's not the first time either. Matter of fact, some of the pardons under Clinton were certainly very scandalous as well. And some of those in each of the administrations have been of concern. I did point out the other day, for what it's worth, that the one individual that has issued fewer pardons after leaving the presidency than anybody since George Herbert Walker Bush was Donald Trump. So most of these others, matter of fact, I think the record is, Obama, but before that, I think it was Clinton. So we can see pardons are one issue, but then he goes on to point out something else we've talked about, and that is Joe Biden has been engaged in a fire sale of steel barriers ordered during the previous Trump administration, which were intended to build a wall and secure our southern border. These were, by the way, he points out, materials paid for with taxpayer money, and yet in a cynical plan to kind of frustrate the administration, they have decided that they would sell those off. Well, now I gave you an update on that as well. The other day when I was on, I think on Monday, I pointed out that you then, or no, I guess we talked about it on Friday too, you had the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Texas, Dan Patrick, saying, well, if they put those up for auction, we'll buy them, especially since some of them have a minimum bid of $5. We'll buy whatever is needed, and we'll just give them to Donald Trump. Now, more recently, you've had a very strong speech by Senator Ted Cruz saying that if anybody in the Department of Health and Homeland Security, I should say, if anyone in the Department of Homeland Security sells these, we are going to consider them actually engaging in theft of federal property and prosecute them through the Justice Department. So I think that did tend to cool the heels of that idea, which then brings us to the third one. You know, we have the pardons, we have the selling off of the steel barriers. The third one, Cal Thomas says, then came the drones. The administration claims that they are not from U.S. adversaries and pose no threat to public health or safety. They've also claimed to know nothing about them. If they know nothing, how can they assert they're not from foreign entities and will not harm people? And, of course, these drones have been seen for weeks over New Jersey and New York, but they've been spotted in California and Nevada. Of course, then he points out that the ex-governor of the state of Maryland, that would be Larry Larry Hogan actually has pictures of drones there in Maryland of what was actually flying over his home. And, of course, with no critical and credible information coming from the Biden administration, then, of course, you have all sorts of conspiracy theories flying around there as well. And while you're talking about some of this, it's intriguing because Cal Thomas also points out that while New York City Mayor Eric Adams says he will cooperate with the incoming Trump administration in removing migrants in the country illegally, even from his so-called sanctuary city, at the same time, you have other Democratic mayors and other Democratic governors who are promised to resist deporting even those who have committed crimes in order to, and this is their phrase, to Trump-proof their cities and states. So, of course, you see that probably is going to change when the border czar Tom Homan comes in there as well. Unless you think that this is really popular with the American people, just the opposite. Because Cal Thomas then points out a poll that I had not seen. So here you've got the information that you might want to use on your Facebook page or Twitter post or whatever. Because according to a poll of registered voters, support for deportation has increased dramatically since 2015. Again, quoting from the poll, among non-white voters, 57% now support mass deportations, while only 33% said they did in 2015. Additionally, the poll says 91% of Republicans now say they support deportations, which is a 21% increase since 2015. Rural voters' support has risen by 20 points. Urban voters by 19 points, and men's support increased 16%. So again, 16 points. So you get all of those agreeing with the idea of deportation. And what's so interesting is even support among registered Democrats, these again are registered voters, has increased to 42% from 34%. So the bottom line is that what you are seeing right now is perhaps, and I think Cal Thomas may be accurate, the worst transition ever. It's certainly, without a doubt, the worst transition we've seen in modern times, which has led some people to think, well, we can't get to a new administration fast enough. And there are some people who are saying, well, can we move the number up? Because it used to be that we did not actually change the presidential administration until March. Now it happens, of course, as you well know, January 20th for the president and even earlier, of course, for Congress. And, of course, there wouldn't be much of a reason to push it up too much further, simply because, again, I know this will surprise you, but we have not technically elected the president of the United States. That comes when we count the electoral votes, which will be counted in June. Of course, you probably learned that from what happened 4 years ago there at the Capitol. And I think it's an illustration that there are certainly some need for an incoming administration to begin to get many of these individuals confirmed so that they can hit the ground running. And that appears to be exactly what the Trump administration is looking to do. But nevertheless, probably the worst transition between one political party, one president, and the next. And if you want to get some of the facts and figures on that, that's our first article written by our friend Cal Thomas. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
If you have ever wondered what kind of impact you have when you give to Point of View, let me introduce you to Bill. His story is a perfect illustration.
Well, I've been a supporter of Point of View since the 70s, and I appreciate the fact that truth and love are discussed equally and that God's Word never changes. We have 4 generations in my family who have been taught these things, these truths, and the 5th generation we've just been blessed with, who I'm sure will be blessed by this ministry also. So I just appreciate the fact that it's solid, it's truthful, it's honest, and there's no changing God's Word.
And that is the kind of multi-generational impact you have when you support Point of View. So give today. Equip the next generation with the clarity of God's unchanging Word. You can give online at pointofview.net or call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, and we're going to spend some time for just a few minutes reminding you don't always believe everything that you hear what somebody says. Just a minute ago, Megan pointed out that when I was meant to say January, I said June. So again, that is the case. But I thought it would be a good opportunity to get into a couple of other issues. First of all, the Electoral College votes will be actually tabulated on January 6, 2025. That's really important to understand. And it is then on January 20th in which we inaugurate the next president, which will be Donald Trump. Now, here's a good example. Don't trust what I say all the time, and check it out. Don't trust what other talk show hosts say as well. I'm driving down the road, and I'm listening to a talk show host on a very prominent talk radio station here in Dallas. He's a very educated individual, so I'm not going to tell you the station or the person. Don't want to embarrass him. But he said that there was somebody had sent in a text saying, why can't we move up the date for the inauguration of the president? And he said, well, we could, but there's really no reason we should. There's nothing in the Constitution that says it has to be January 20th. And I'm thinking, yes, there is something in the Constitution that says it's January 20th. Now, technically, you say, well, it's not in the original Constitution, but if you go to the 20th Amendment, and I always bring my Constitution here, and during the break just made sure that I wasn't misremembering something. No, on January 20th, it established that the inauguration now would be January 20th. That was first implemented in 1937. Why is that? Well, you have incoming Franklin Delano Roosevelt after Herbert Hoover has been defeated, and you have the Great Depression. And there was a need to wait till March, which was the original date for the inauguration of the president. That made a great deal of sense in the 18th century, really much in the 19th century as well. It took time to get to Washington, D.C. It took time to count the votes. California, you still look a lot like you're in the 19th century. We'll go on. And all sorts of other issues. And so in January 20th, 1937 was the first time we ever had an inauguration on that date. And if we wanted to change it, and I do not recommend that we do so, I don't think that we should, but if we do, we would have to actually come up with another constitutional amendment. So just because somebody says, well, it's not in the Constitution, it really is. It's in the 20th Amendment of the Constitution, and just one of those little factoids that maybe you need to know. While I'm on a roll, let me talk about some people you shouldn't trust either, and that's a lot of people in the mainstream media. Jeff Blahar put it this way the other day. How many of you held on to your admission offer from your college application days? As a follow-up, did any of you keep an offer letter from a school you decided not to attend? If you don't know where we're going, we're talking about Pete Hegseth. There was a story that these people that are at the left of center activists, ProPublica, were going to do is saying that he was claiming that he was accepted to West Point, and that's an outright lie. And so then they even asked West Point's administration about his application, and the school on two separate occasions denied that Pete Hegseth had been admitted or that he'd even applied to West Point. And so when they came to some representatives of Pete Hegseth, he then produced, and I would have to say that's amazing. I can't think that I have any of the letters that actually brought me into undergraduate or graduate school, and again, it's pretty prestigious because it is from West Point, and maybe he framed it for all I know, but the bottom line is he brings out the letter and says, oh yes, here's the letter of my acceptance, in which he decided, after all, if you're not familiar with his story, he went to Princeton instead and went into ROTC. So he was very serious about going to West Point, but over that time certainly changed his mind. And what Jeff Blahar was pointing out is We nearly averted a media equivalent of a midair collision, and a week later, everybody is whistling past the graveyard. He says, why aren't people appalled as I am? He says, look, I've not been a defender of Pete Hegseth's nomination, but the fact that he came within a hair's breadth of having his nomination sunk by what have been a fake scandal makes me wary of even the power of the media to destroy individuals. And of course, we've talked about this before. If the CNN sees a young person out there on the mall and an individual who's beating a drum gets in his face, we assume that the young person is at fault. And as a result, we then begin to criticize him and everyone else. Of course, they then had to pay a pretty hefty fine for that. Or, as we announced the other day, the rather multi-million-dollar fine that ABC News had to pay for claiming that Donald Trump was convicted of rape and all sorts of other media malpractice that has existed for generations. Not just one generation, but goes back quite a ways and has gotten almost worse, especially if people have what you might call Trump derangement syndrome. So you might say, okay, Kerby, you're making a big deal. Yes, okay, this is a ProPublica. It's not exactly mainstream media. They're coming after Pete Hegseth. They took the word of by the way, West Point finally said, oh, wait a minute, we were wrong. He was accepted after all. They took the word of that. So that's, not quite the same as mainstream media. So I come to my second one. And this one happened on December 11th, about a week ago. And that's where ABC's News' Jay O'Brien actually made some very disparaging comments on ABC News Live Prime, in which in the first minute of this interview that Jay O'Brien did, that stated that Linda McMahon actually is going to be probably confirmed, and then made this statement. This is a direct quote. If she receives Senate confirmation, McMahon, who has no formal teaching training and little experience in education, will be tasked with setting policies for the nation's schools. As one person pointed out, everything about that sentence is wrong. Won't get into all the details, but first of all, she had a bachelor's degree from East Carolina University, then earned a teaching certificate after completing teacher preparation at the school, and to be fair, at least some of the mainstream media got it right. That would be the Washington Post, USA Today, and a few others. But here you are watching the interview on ABC News, and the first thing you hear is that if she is confirmed by the United States Senate, we're going to put a person in the Secretary of Education position who has no formal teacher training and little experience in education. Everything about that pretty much is wrong. But it's, again, just an illustration of why you need to be discerning and check other facts and other sources of news and information. So I'll give credit to the Washington Post and USA Today, and I'll put a check mark, maybe a F mark, since we're talking about education, for ABC News. And so, again, you can see the need for you to have discernment. One last point I'll mention real quickly, and that is this open letter that I've posted here comes from a couple of individuals in which they're encouraging that if he is confirmed, and this one may not happen, but we'll see, that is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is confirmed as Secretary of Health and Human Services. They're encouraging him to work with the FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr to put an end to pharmaceutical companies advertising prescription drugs on television. They said the sheer amount of dollars being spent on TV advertising by Big Pharma should raise suspicion among those who care about accuracy in media and information being consumed by the public. And they said it's an old trick's been used before. Those of you old enough remember, what was the trick? Remember all the ads that used to exist with big tobacco on TV? And so as a result, news organizations back in the 1950s and 60s were more reluctant to expose some of the concerns that were raised at the time about tobacco and about cigarettes, because they were certainly providing an abundance of media ad revenue. And they're saying that what big tobacco did, say, 70 years ago, big pharma is doing today. And he gives some examples. For example, Ozempic, which could be helpful for those suffering from type 2 diabetes, but actually is now just being promoted day in and day out, almost in every commercial pie that you can find by pharmaceutical companies as an aid for weight loss, though your monthly cost could be more than $1,000. You might even get hooked for life. And then just talk about the fact in this particular case that among all the other high-income countries, only the United States and New Zealand allow for advertising by pharmaceutical companies. So it's just an interest point, and it's one more illustration that if Robert F. Kennedy gets into office, it may not be the first thing he does, but it might come rather quickly. And again, you can see why there are so many people that are trying to oppose, for example, the possible confirmation of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Let's take a break. We'll cover some more topics right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention also that we're going to spend some time next hour talking about this new book, The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever. So we'll get into that in just a minute. I've been talking about, of course, the opportunity for you to still contact your member of Congress about what is happening right now in terms of the budget. And I'm going to get to this very good article by Jeb Hensarling. He is a former member of Congress. Matter of fact, he was the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, actually serves with Americans for Prosperity, and also an economics fellow at the Cato Institute. And you might remember Bunny Pounds. Bunny Pounds used to actually be on his staff there as well. So you can go to the website and find that action item. But as you go there, you also see we have the banner that says Give the Gift of Truth. I just talked a few minutes ago about maybe not trusting everybody that is maybe receiving millions of dollars in terms of funding from big pharma, or individuals that are in very expensive studios giving you false information. One of the things we really try to do is work much harder at trying to give you accurate information and news and information that you can trust. And if you value that, I hope that as we come to year end, you can join with us. And I wanted to give you an update. We used to have a matching challenge, and now it's up to even higher, to $125,000 of matching challenge. Again, I know some of you wait till the next week or so, but I hope some of you might say, if the match is on right now, and it is a dollar for dollar match, I'd be glad to click on that button that says Give Now and support your ministry. So recognize that we now have been able to, with some more generous gifts, raise that matching challenge up to $125,000. And it's available now. If you wait till December 30th or 31st, we hope it'll still be there, although I, in some respects, hope it won't be, because at that point, that means we've done fairly well and been able to pay our bills. So again, we have that gift of truth opportunity for you to give, and it's on the website at pointofview.net. But let me come back to this, because Jeb Hensarling is a former member of Congress, but he also says we're about ready to hit what everybody referred to as the fiscal cliff. This is a good example of something that would have existed whether we elected Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. And that's because the various provisions of the 2017 Trump-Pence Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will expire at the end of this year. And at the same time, we also have a debt ceiling currently capping a record gross national debt of $36 trillion. And also you have another act, which I won't go into, that would actually be another issue. So there are reasons, he says, that Congress should be alarmed. And the Fed has been cutting rates. Bond yields have been rising, which suggests that maybe some people question America's ballooning national debt. And he wrote this, of course, a day ago. But since then, we have all sorts of other reasons why people would be concerned. Because if you looked over the last 9 days at the Dow Jones Industrial Average, it dropped 9 consecutive days. That's the longest time we've had a drop of 9 consecutive days since 1978. Some of the people listening to this program were not born in 1978. To make it worse, if today the stock hadn't rallied a little bit, that would have been a 11-day slide, and that takes you back to 1974. So you're recognizing that there are some economic headwinds. There's some economic concerns on the horizon. And you know that now that Donald Trump will come into office, everybody's going to expect that as soon as you can snap those fingers, everything is going to be better. But the reality is just the opposite, and there's going to be a need to address some of these issues very quickly. Well, Jeb Hensarling is very smart about this, and he said, well, there's some things we can do. And that is, first of all, let's support and well, I guess we could actually say reenact, probably the better word, or to ratify once again the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, but also then says that there are some things in the tax cut code that could be maybe enhanced. And he gives a few ideas about that as well, because we have basically a $5 trillion hole in our congressional budgets that need to be addressed. And so maybe the things we should do are going to be needed in terms of capital investments and that. There's certain things we shouldn't do, and you've seen some commentaries have written about that. Tariffs by Donald Trump might raise a little bit of money, but it's probably going to hurt us more than it's going to help us. The idea of maybe eliminating taxes on Social Security benefits for individuals of a certain age, that would put a hole in it as well. And if nothing else, he's saying maybe we should have Congress deal with the whole issue of state and local governments in terms of whether or not the full deductibility of state and local taxes should be implemented. So this goes on for 3 pages of things that can and should be done, and as a result then comes to the end by reminding us of one more very important issue. And that is, as much as we are excited that there could be a way to cut the size and scope of government through the work that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy will do through what's called DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, he also reminds us that most of the federal spending is growing because of entitlements like Medicare and Social Security, also because we have to make interest payments on the national debt. Those have to be paid. And again, a significant amount of defense spending needs to take place. And so as a result, it doesn't leave as much for DOGE, or the Department of Government Efficiency, to trim, but anything is better than nothing. And so there is going to be a real need to reevaluate some of these tax expenditures, maybe whether we should reevaluate some of these exclusions, deductions, and credits and things of that nature. And of course, also reducing some of these tax expenditures that were implemented under Joe Biden's American Rescue Plan and the so-called misnamed Inflation Reduction Act. So again, lots of times people say, well, we aren't doing anything. And part of the problem is you can't fix a problem if you won't acknowledge there's a problem in the first place. And Jim Hensarling ends by saying, look, life is full of lousy options and tough decisions. To keep and improve a tax code built for economic growth, Congress will not only have to cut the federal budget, but also reduce some of the tax expenditures. But again, that is something that will guarantee that we have a government running in the future. So these are problems that existed whether you elected Kamala Harris or whether you elected Donald Trump. Some of these intractable problems, like, for example, the declining fertility rate, the fact that a lot of young men are not in the workforce, the fact that we have a $36 trillion national debt, those are things at least we try to talk about here on Point of View. A lot of politicians don't want to talk about it, and a lot of media outlets just don't even ask questions about it. But those are facts that need to be on the table as well. These are the things we're going to have to address as we go forward into the year of 2025. So again, we've posted quite a number of articles for you to read, and I would encourage you to take the time to maybe read one or two. I would hope that you might want to click on the button that says Give Now to support this ministry. And I still think it's time for you to contact your members of Congress. We need to avoid a government shutdown, but more importantly, we need to have the federal government finally have a federal budget. Every other state has a federal budget. It's time for the federal government to do the same. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Our nation is experiencing a major realignment right now. Political and cultural frameworks are shifting. Perhaps for the first time in a long time, some things are starting to shift in a positive direction. But as this political and cultural realignment takes place, another realignment is desperately needed, a realignment to God's Word. Data shows that few Americans' worldview is aligned with biblical truth, but you can help change that by partnering with Point of View, where God's truth comes first. When you support Point of View, every dollar you give ensures that a biblical perspective is accessible to listeners across the nation and around the world every day. Right now, every dollar you give will go especially far because every dollar you give through December will be matched up to $118,000. So give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
One of the things we talk about on this program is the search for meaning and significance, even sometimes the search for transcendence. Now, some people have said maybe the way to find transcendence is through various kinds of drugs or other kind of chemical experiences that might happen. Some have searched through various cults and world religions, through money, sex, religion, all sorts of things are part of that. And I thought that this might be an interesting conversation today. It's based on the book, The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever, Transcendence, Psychedelics, and Jesus Christ. And it is interesting because the author, Ashley Lande, talks about the fact that really there was maybe a promise that indeed psychedelics would be a way to find transcendence. They were, as she says, my sacrament, shot me into cathedral vaults and all the rest. But there was an emptiness there as well. And Justin Brierly's been on the program with us before, said, in a generation that is thirsting for an experience of something transcendent, this book will show you why that hunger can only be truly satisfied by Jesus Christ. So Ashley, as I might mention, is an artist, a writer. We have a link to her website, lives in rural Kansas with her husband and 4 children. Her writings have appeared in Fathom Magazine, Mops Magazine, and others. This book came out in October. And Ashley, welcome to Point of View.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
If you can, I would love to have you maybe just tell your story, because in some respects, the book is mostly about your story and the desire to find meaning through various kinds of psychedelics, mushrooms, and things of that nature. And as a result, I think it might relate to others that are convinced that they only can find meaning through other kinds of chemicals and drugs as well. So how did this begin? Because we'd love to know your whole story as well.
Sure, thank you. Well, I was raised in a somewhat Christian home. I'm glad I had something of a foundation, but I wouldn't say that faith was necessarily a huge part of my childhood or really integrated into my home life. My parents both became stronger in their faith as they got older after I was an adult. But we did go to church a lot of the time when I was very little, and not so as much when I was a teenager. So I did have some foundation of the Christian faith, but I never really understood the gospel. I never really understood what Jesus Christ had done for me. And so when I was around 14 or 15 and started really, I've always been a voracious reader, I started coming in contact with other ideas about religion, specifically atheistic ideas, ideas about other religions. And I just found anything countercultural very appealing. I was rebellious. And so it was pretty easy for me because, as I said, I had never really understood the gospel despite having something of a foundation of the Christian faith. And so when I was 14 and 15 and these ideas I was consuming mostly through books seemed so appealing and exotic, it was pretty easy for me to completely disavow the faith that I was raised with. I said I was an atheist. It was really kind of this blithe, rebellious thing, like I said. And my parents were upset, but I think, they hoped it was just a phase I was going through, so there wasn't a major intervention or anything. And I continued on that path for several years through high school and started encountering mind-altering substances, think maybe when I was 16, I smoked marijuana for the first time. I didn't really get high. It wasn't really effective, but I was very attracted to the idea of taking something that could alter my consciousness and could give me a different perspective, and was introduced to alcohol toward the end of high school, and continued consuming alcohol in really destructive ways throughout a lot of my college experience, but eventually became pretty disenchanted with that because it was so destructive, and there was always such a high cost for getting drunk. The next morning there was a pounding hangover.
Mm-hmm.
And I also came to feel a sense of shame, even though I had embraced all of the ideas of like libertinism and sexual freedom and the sexual revolution. There was always, I couldn't escape my own conscience. And so there was always this lingering sense of shame. And so I became disenchanted with party life. And toward the end of my last year in college, I had a friend who said that he could get some psilocybin mushrooms, also known as magic mushrooms. And I thought, why not? I was up for anything. I didn't have any morality around consuming mind-altering substances or any reason that I would have any pause about it whatsoever. And so I said, sure, why not? And that first experience, there wasn't necessarily a spiritual dimension to it for me. I was still pretty firmly an atheist after that experience, but I just thought it was wonderful. I thought it was fun. I thought it was interesting and fascinating. And I knew I had found something that I wanted to pursue further. I would say at the time it supplied what seemed to be a sense of transcendence, just something outside of the consciousness I had experienced to that point. And I was seduced. I was very, very interested in it. So over the course of the next year or so, I was able to find and purchase magic mushrooms a few more times, I think. And then maybe a year after that initial experience, I encountered someone who had LSD, and I figured that was just the same as mushrooms, no big deal. And I took that and had a pretty shattering experience. It was very traumatic in some ways, but there again, I was also fascinated by it. I thought it was really interesting. I wasn't sure that I was an atheist anymore. I still would never have wanted to hear anything about Jesus Christ. I just closed my ears as soon as someone started talking about that, but it did make me more spiritually open to all manner of other things. And it was from then on, probably the next 6 to 7 years, I spent taking psychedelics with varying degrees of frequency, and really pursued that path all the way to the end of the line. And I'm summarizing greatly here. Obviously, I wrote a whole book about it, but toward the end of that period, I had met my husband. We actually met at our drug dealer's house, the person that people that we bought LSD from. Yeah, seemed like a match made in heaven in that sense. We both liked LSD a lot. But we both slowly over those years became disillusioned with psychedelics as a path to transcendence, as a path to meaning, as a path to anything at all, really. And like I said, I'm drastically summarizing here. It was a long, slow arc, and thank the Lord, he's very patient. But yeah.
And what we're going to do is take a break, because I want to come back and maybe dip into each one of those areas. Because, for example, one of the things that was instrumental in your atheism was reading books by Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens. We talk about that on the program. Also about just how, in some respects, we maybe can, as a warning, talk to parents and other young people listening to this program today about how, in some respects, one particular experience leads to another. So I do want to kind of break that down, but I think you gave us a brief overview. We haven't gotten you saved yet, but that's in the later chapters anyway. So we'll come back and talk a little bit more about this new book, The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever, Transcendence, Psychedelics, and Jesus Christ. And we'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the carol O Come, Emmanuel is an English translation of a Latin hymn that was sung during Advent and Christmas. The text goes back to at least the 18th century and perhaps much earlier, while the music goes back to the 15th century. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. Emmanuel means God with us. Even before the coming of Christ, we see passages in the Old Testament that remind us that God was with Israel. In 1 Kings 8, we read, "Praise the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel, just as he promised. Not one word has failed of all the wonderful promises he gave through his servant Moses. May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our ancestors. May he never leave us or abandon us." In Psalm 46, we read that the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. One of the most visible reminders of God's presence was during the Exodus. God was with the Israelites as a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of smoke by day. His presence was with them in the tabernacle and later in the temple in the Holy of Holies. But the most important aspect of Emmanuel is found in the New Testament. John tells us in his gospel, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." This is the miracle of the incarnation. God put on human flesh and came to Israel so that he might give his life for all of us. Paul writes to Timothy, "Here is the great mystery of our religion. Christ came as a human." This is what we celebrate at Christmas. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to spend some time, if we can, kind of breaking down some of the story that we've already heard from Ashley Lande. The book is entitled The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever, in which you really have kind of a trajectory from an individual who is an atheist and then sort of decides to get involved in some of the psychedelics and things of that nature, maybe a trajectory from acid enthusiast to soul-weary druggie to psychedelic refugee, and then eventually finding an answer in the last place you thought to look. Actually, one of the things I'm going to do, hold up for right now, people watching online, my booklet on the new atheist. We have produced this in the past. It came out a couple of years ago, and I may need to update it. But at the time when you were younger, you actually stumbled upon a number of very important books. And that's in Chapter 2, The Godless Light. You had sampled Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, as well as, of course, Letter to a Christian Nation by Sam Harris. Even, of course, you might even think about the one which you kind of read and then kind of dismissed by Christopher Hitchens, God is Not Great. And I think that's important because part of your search could have changed differently if you had maybe paid more attention. For example, one of the books you were given is the Left Behind series, but it does seem to me that these particular atheistic books captured your attention and really set you on a path to try to find your own meaning and significance really apart from God. Is that fair?
Yes, that's very fair. Yeah. And I think I was just really, I wish that, and, I'm not blaming anyone, but I wish that I had been introduced more to intellectually robust Christianity. Like, I think things could have perhaps been different if I had been introduced to C.S. Lewis. But part of the reason I was so seduced by Christopher Hitchens at first anyway is that he was very intellectual. He was very clever.
Sure.
He seemed very sophisticated. Now when I was writing my book, I went back and I read some of his writings, and they didn't seem nearly as clever as they did when I was 17, 18, But yeah, I was not at all familiar with the tradition of, like I said, intellectually robust Christianity. And so I just kind of dismissed Christianity out of hand as something for dumb people or weak people, which is what Hitchens et al. Would present it as. And I wanted to be part of the intelligentsia. I wanted to be intellectual. I wanted to be, and I saw it. And I also can't discount, there was a boy I had a crush on when I was 14, 15, and he was a rabid atheist. And I remember him saying something like no intelligent person can be a person of religious faith. And of course, since this was someone, I was a teenage girl, this is someone I looked up to and had a crush on, I thought, oh, he's probably right. So like I said, I can't discount that whole, the role of that and everything. But yeah, I just really thought, and Christopher Hitchens in particular just seemed very, very smart to me, very clever. And when I would see film of him, like he seemed to have a comeback for everything, and he was never left speechless. Certainly, that was one thing about him. He always had a quip for everything, and I think that was really appealing to me.
Sure. But again, I think there's a lesson to be learned. That is, when your kids ask intellectual questions, you should be able to give them intellectual answers. And that's why we make these booklets available, more than 70 of them. Yeah. This one on the new atheist, got one on drug abuse, which we'll talk about later. But what I thought was intriguing is, of course, that's in chapter 2. By the time I get to chapter 3 and following, there is a sense in which you're still looking for significance, looking for transcendence, maybe not overtly, but there's oftentimes people have said we have a God-shaped vacuum, or Ecclesiastes says eternity is in the heart of every individual. You were seeking for something, and maybe it wasn't fulfilling to be an atheist, so maybe something that looked more like the New Age, or of course you were interacting with people that, for example, had Be Here Now, or the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or many different things that you mentioned there that also in some respects were causing you to look for some kind of spirituality, some kind of transcendence, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I thought, and there was, even before I had that first experience with LSD, like I said, that was in some ways a really not a good experience and a traumatic experience. I was becoming slowly disillusioned with atheism. Like, it just was starting to reveal its emptiness to me. It was starting to reveal its hollowness. And I remember being so excited for Christopher Hitchens' new book to come out, which was titled God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, which, characteristically extremely arrogant title. And I remember sitting down to read it and getting maybe, a third of the way or halfway through it, and just feeling like if this is the truth, if this is the definitive truth, there is no God. And it's ironic, too, when I went back and read it just not a few years ago in preparation to write my book, Hitchens would often appeal to art and music and literature as sources of transcendence. And I just found that really insufficient, because it's like, okay, well, what's the source of artistic inspiration? And in particular, he really admired Dostoevsky, which is super interesting because Dostoevsky was a Christian. And I mean, all his works were Christian, and they were wrestling, with Christian ideas and very Christian solutions, I guess you could say. And so I found that really fascinating. But like I said, it was just slowly revealing to me its vacuity. But I didn't know, like I said, I had already dismissed Christianity out of hand, so I didn't know what could take its place. And so then once, I was in that position, and then I had what seemed to be this really profound, transcendent experience on LSD, which, like I said, it seemed to be very transcendent and profound, yet I could not have articulated what that profundity was or what it was about. It just seemed profound. That seemed to at least for the moment, it seemed to fill that hole, or it seemed to promise to fill that God-shaped hole, even if it didn't necessarily fully satisfy it immediately. It seemed to offer the path to satisfying that, the path to meaning, the path to fulfillment. And so I was all in pretty quickly from that first time that I took LSD. And as I wrote about in the book, of course, it led down. Eventually, the trajectory was very bad.
Yes.
But at first, it seemed fascinating. It seemed exotic. It seemed in some ways wonderful. And so it's very seductive.
I thought I just might even mention that you actually had your first art show, of which really were acid-fueled and speed-fueled pen drawings called Glutting the Sensorium. And so people seeing that might go, wow, that's really creative and everything else. But then the next line you say is that I felt a bone-deep pang of loneliness shudder through my soul. I had everything, and I had it all at once, I believe, but I was desperately lonely. Tears began to roll down my cheeks. So anybody looking at on the outside might say, you're an artist, you're creative, you've pulled together all sorts of things that I would never have developed. And so because of maybe dipping into those drugs, and yet from the outside, you looked very successful. On the inside, you were deeply pained and lonely, weren't you?
Yes, I was a mess. I was really a mess. And the interesting thing, too, about my artwork at that time was, I would say that I was kind of, in a lot of ways, a peace and love hippie. Love and light was always the phrase that people would throw around in the New Age community. And I was very into yoga. But all my artwork was very, very dark. Like, it just had a lot of really dark elements to it. And, of course, I couldn't see that at the time. But now if I look back at the work that I created during that time, it was actually really dark. And I think people were startled by it. I know my poor parents, I coerced them or convinced them to come to my art opening, and I'm sure they were really disturbed. But my life was a complete mess. I couldn't hold down a job. I had worked temp jobs for a while. I had worked at a restaurant for a while, but I just didn't, it was a pretty upscale restaurant, and I just didn't care enough about reality to actually memorize the menu like I was supposed to, and do these basic fundamental tasks that I was supposed to complete to keep this job. And I just didn't care to do it. So after that, I got fired from the restaurant. I think I was just working temp jobs. And like I said, my life was just, it was a mess. And I was desperately lonely. I couldn't keep a relationship together. I couldn't even really maintain my friendships at that point. And I became, in that time too, I was taking psychedelics pretty often just by myself. Sometimes I would take them with other people, but sometimes I would take them by myself, and I was very ceremonial about it. I felt I was very almost like liturgical about it. I had these rules around it, but I was so lonely, and I became increasingly disconnected from reality.
We'll take a break and continue our story right after these important messages.
If you have ever wondered what kind of impact you have when you give to Point of View, let me introduce you to Bill. His story is a perfect illustration.
Well, I've been a supporter of Point of View since the 70s, and I appreciate the fact that truth and love are discussed equally and that God's Word never changes. We have 4 generations in my family who have been taught these things, these truths, and the 5th generation we've just been blessed with, who I'm sure will be blessed by this ministry also. So I just appreciate the fact that it's solid, it's truthful, it's honest, and there's no changing God's Word.
And that is the kind of multi-generational impact you have when you support Point of View. So give today. Equip the next generation with the clarity of God's unchanging Word. You can give online at pointofview.net or call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Ashley Lande as we talk about the book, The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever, Transcendence, Psychedelics, and Jesus Christ. We have a link to her website if you would like to follow her there. Of course, you can also find out how you can follow her both on Facebook and X. And we, of course, have a book which you might be able to find in your local bookstore, but we've made it very easy for you to get it either in Kindle or paperback, all available at our website at pointofview.net. Let's, if we can, then talk about that, because in the midst of this, all the questions and difficulties, you find a relationship, of all places, with a fellow person using drugs. Can you share the rest of that?
Oh, yes. Well, yeah, I met my husband at our mutual friend's house. This is a person that we bought LSD from. And we moved very quickly. We got engaged maybe 3 weeks after we started dating, and we got married, I think, a month and a half after that. And by the grace of God, we celebrated 16 years of marriage this past summer. Yes. And that is solely by the grace of God. But yeah, that, like I said, at first it seemed, I was so infatuated, and it seemed to make so much sense. Like, we both loved LSD. We both believed psychedelics were a path to transcendence, and we both enjoyed taking them. And it was a slow, like I said, a slow disenchantment with psychedelics for both of us. I think, I don't want to speak for my husband. He had his own experience, but he was the one who actually started becoming interested in Christianity before I did. Mm-hmm. And at first, for him, it was more of he was always interested in exploring different world religions, which I was to an extent as well, but he had a more, I guess you could say, like, scholarly approach to it. He wanted to go back and read the original text. And so, ironically, there was someone we both really loved named Ram Dass, who was a huge figure in which I'm sure you've heard of him. His original name was Richard Alpert, and he was a professor at Harvard with Timothy Leary. And he was very influential for both of us, and particularly his book, Be Here Now. But my husband read in one of his other books, he said something about something like, you should immerse yourself in whatever religious tradition you find yourself surrounded with, locally, geographically, like the people you're around. You should immerse yourself in that religious tradition. And Stephen, my husband, got to a point where, like I said, he was, like me, increasingly disillusioned with psychedelics, and he thought, well, we live in the Midwest in the United States of America. The obvious choice to investigate would be Christianity. Like, why not see what it's all about? And like I said, it's ironic because Ram Dass, would never have endorsed the exclusivity of Jesus Christ, but his take was just, there are many paths to God, and you might as well try this one. And when you try it, like, throw yourself into it completely. And so initially for my husband, it began just as this investigation of, like, this is one of many paths to God, but it's the one that I'm surrounded by. So I might as well try it, I might as well see what it's all about. And I was, even though, like I said, I had gotten to a place of desperation with realizing, like, the drugs were not working anymore. And in fact, they were producing really, really bad experiences for me. And I felt lost. I felt confused. But I was very resistant at first to his forays into Christianity. And he actually started seeing a therapist. This was around when our oldest son was probably 1.5, and I had become pregnant with our daughter. And obviously we weren't using psychedelics with the frequency that we had before we had children, but every once in a while, if we had an afternoon to ourselves, if we had one of our parents babysitting or had a babysitter, we would take them, usually a smaller dose. Like, we usually didn't do the big doses anymore. So we were still very much invested in psychedelics at that point. And he was a daily marijuana smoker as well. I would partake some of the time, but not daily like he did. And he started seeing a therapist because he found himself really struggling with some anger issues. And the therapist challenged him to do two things. to quit smoking marijuana every day and to go to church.
Wow.
And Stephen, I think, was glad to be challenged by someone, and so he took up the challenge. He didn't completely give up marijuana, but he stopped smoking it every single day before work. And he decided he was going to try a church. And there was a church maybe 6 blocks away from where we lived in Kansas City. And so he said he wanted to try it. And at first I said, like I said, it was this tension because I was lost and I was so confused and I was so desperate. But I still had what I'm sure was in part a supernatural aversion to Christianity. Because like I said, I was open to almost anything else. But as soon as someone started talking about Christ, at least in an exclusive way, as the way, the truth, and the life, I really didn't want to hear about it. So at first I really resisted that. And then it was maybe in my 8th month of pregnancy with my daughter that I finally consented, reluctantly still, to go to church with him. And I remember just feeling I really didn't want to be there. I wanted to sit near the back. But as the worship music washed over me, I felt this sense of relief. And I remember weeping and sobbing uncontrollably. I was embarrassed. I didn't want to be weeping and sobbing in front of other people. But I just felt this sense of relief. I was just so tired of DIY salvation. I was tired of trying to save myself. I was tired of trying to save myself through drugs, through yoga, through meditation. I was just so tired. And so I think that was the moment. That wasn't the moment I was saved, but I still had a lot of arrogance and resistance in my heart. But I would say that was kind of the beginning of the God lovingly breaking down that resistance. And that was the beginning of me thinking, maybe there is more to this than I thought. Maybe there is something to Jesus Christ. And that was really the beginning of that for me.
Well, again, you talk about through the valley, it's well with my soul, tasting the real thing. Some of those chapters get into some more of that journey, but a lot of it has to do with if I can, again, harken back to when you already begun to reject Christianity and you even for a while accepted atheism, even if later you were sort of more of a psychedelic new age type of person, it's hard to go back. But it seems that was a good example of how maybe the impact came more from an emotional set of circumstances. The worship music made you cry. You still maybe had the intellectual thoughts, so your heart was maybe opening even if your head was still resisting. Is that a fair assessment of what was going on?
Yes, it is. And it's interesting that was the way it went for me. I feel like my heart was softened, and God took my heart of stone and gave me a heart of flesh. That happened for me before, I guess what you could call an intellectual conversion or a theological understanding.
Right.
That came later for me. It kind of filled in because then I wanted to know, once my heart was open, I wanted to know, like, what is this all about? Like, I know that I know that it's true, but I want to understand it more. And it's interesting, my husband, actually, for him, it was the opposite.
Right.
It was vice versa. He felt like the theological understanding came first, and he was still struggling with surrendering himself to it, even though he came to a point where theologically he said, okay, I understand this, it makes sense, I believe it's true. And he was actually raised Mormon, but rejected that as a teenager. And although he said he never became an atheist, he'll say I wasn't that much of an idiot. But he never, like I said, he certainly wasn't a Christian either. And so it's interesting for him, he kind of went the other direction. But yeah, for me, it was very much my heart was, the Lord softened my heart first. And I think for me, that's what the Lord knew that's what needed to happen for me.
Again, let's take a break. When we come back, maybe talk a little bit more. I love at one point where you're talking about as the pastor began preaching, the dissonance inside me grew, and with it, a wave of emotion threatened to set me weeping. And, of course, talking about some of those experiences as well. Because when we come back, I wanted maybe to have just share a little bit about where you go from here and maybe some warnings or some suggestions you might make to parents who are raising children kind of like you that are creative, maybe a little bit more more right hemisphere creative and maybe quite willing to read some of these books and engage in some of the experiences that kept you really from accepting Christ until later in your life. And so I wanted to get maybe some thoughts about that. And if you would like to know more about Ashley, we do have a link to the website there. It is full of all sorts of bright colors, and I'll hold this up, as is her book. So I think you'll get a real sense of the kind of artistic material that she likes to engage in. And as I've mentioned already, one of the individuals we've had on this program is Justin Brierley, author of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. But there are some other endorsements of the book, and it is a fascinating read, and one that might just, again, encourage you to do what you can to reach out to your young children and maybe warn them of the dangers that they might engage in so that they don't have to travel down the same path that Ashley Lande had to. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Again, the book is entitled The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever. And Ashley, you do spend some time, of course, talking about what the future might hold and how to really think through this, focusing on tasting the real thing, for example, your last chapter in the book, or even the one before that, where you spend a little bit of time talking about some of the other aspects. It is well with my soul. So maybe share with us where you are today, and maybe as you do that, even some things that we might pass on to our listeners that maybe can learn some lessons vicariously from your own spiritual journey and experience.
Sure, yeah. Well, I think one of the reasons that I was able to write so freely and so vulnerably, although the vulnerability is a little scary, um, about my experiences is that I was writing about 10 to 15 years ago. So I'm 41 now, and I was 22, 23 the first time that I took psychedelics. And we became Christians when it's been more than a decade. Um, so yeah, that's been like I said, everything in this book happened 10 to 15 years ago. And it was interesting. After we came to Christ and after we were saved, there was a period of about 3 to 5 years where I did not want to think about psychedelics. I didn't want to talk about psychedelics. I just wanted to know more about Jesus, which is not to say I was obviously a perfect Christian. There were still so many things and still are so many things that I feel like God needed to root out of my heart and reshape me and transform me through the renewing of my mind. But I just didn't want anything to do with that whole world anymore. I even quit doing yoga, which I had been super devoted to yoga for years and years. And I just couldn't bear like the associations, because for me it was a religion. And so there was so much baggage with it. I couldn't bear the associations with it. And once I started viewing it as a religion, which it does, whether or not someone practicing it views it as a religion, it has very religious origins, but that's a whole nother issue. But yeah, for the longest time, I did not want to, I felt really, I guess, like traumatized in a way by all my experiences. I just didn't want anything to do with them anymore. And it's only been in the past maybe 5 years, I started thinking about it more and thinking, maybe I should write about this, because I saw that psychedelics were having a resurgence in popularity and culture. These major figures like Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, who's the Green Bay Packers, or he was the Green Bay Packers, Aaron Rodgers. These celebrities and very influential people were coming out and talking about endorsing psychedelics. So I thought, maybe it would be helpful to someone, for a Christian who says, who can say, like, I did a ton of psychedelics, like I believed in psychedelics. I believed in the power of them, and ultimately they led me to a very bad place, and then Jesus alone can save. And so I started thinking, maybe it was a good idea to write about it. I never intended to write a book about it. It's interesting how that came about. It was definitely God orchestrating that. But I wanted to say, now that my own children, so I have my 2 oldest children are 15 and 13, and then we have a 2-year-old, and I said 4 children. I'm actually pregnant. The 4th one is still on the inside. I'm about 24 weeks pregnant. But like you said, and now that we're kind of navigating that with our own children, those really formative ages, which for me, like I said, the point I made that switch from disavowing Christianity, which I'd always been a pretty good, compliant kid, and I would have said I was a Christian. Like I said, even though I didn't necessarily think I had an understanding of the gospel, I would have said I was a Christian, and that switch for me came around 14, 15 years old. And I think I look back on it, and like I said, I don't want to put any culpability on my parents. I have so much grace for them. They were doing the best that they could, and they both grew in their faith after I was an adult. But I think that those ages were really formative. And so I look at my own children, and I think, and like you said, especially if someone has a child who is more creative and is more attracted to art and literature, I think you have to make sure that they're being introduced to people like C.S. Lewis, to people like Tolkien, and this like intellectually robust and Christianity that's really grappling with and wrestling with these questions, these deep questions. And I think you have to think about like what is going to capture my child's imagination. And also, like, who are they going to view as authoritative? I think that was a big turning point for me, is I just really started viewing people other than my parents as authoritative. And I went to public school, large public school, suburban public school up through 8th grade. And then my parents sent me to a private Catholic school, which, yes, it was a Catholic school, but it was not at all religiously conservative. And so I just encountered these other people who were secular, and they seemed interesting and they seemed fascinating. And so I think, and I just started exploring for myself, like trying to find interesting literature. I got really into the beat poets, Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, people like that, and they seemed really, really wild and interesting and artistic and creative. And so I just think it's so important. Like I said, now that I'm navigating this with my own children, and my 15-year-old boy in particular is more intellectually curious. Not that my daughter isn't, but he's older too. Is more intellectually curious. Like discussing, not being afraid to discuss these questions with them, and not being outraged, I think, by questions. Yeah. And just being willing to take the time. Like I said, I don't want to heap blame on my parents because we had a lot going on when I was a teenager, but I just think that's really important. Yeah. And like I said, I wonder if things maybe could have gone differently for me if I keep mentioning C.S. Lewis just because he's such a huge figure and has such a large body of work. But I've come to love C.S. Lewis and his work. So I just wonder if maybe things could have taken a different path if I had been introduced to that. So,
well, again, I think this book is a cautionary tale, and it's a good example of that. And just before we let everybody go and let you go, I thought I might mention that if you go to your website, ashleylande.com, Deep Mystery, Deep Majesty, there is your artwork there, which is just incredible, and I think people will enjoy clicking on that. There's a place where they can subscribe and learn a little bit more about what you are doing. There's articles and podcasts, including, a video on finding God after psychedelics and a number of other interviews that you've done. So all of that is available at our website, as well as this book. And I just appreciate you once again taking the time to share the story. I appreciate your vulnerability, and I appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
We are going to take a break, but just before we do so, let me just mention again that the book is available on the website at pointofview.net. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but I think probably easier to get it in paperback or Kindle, and we have that link there as well. Just before we wind down today, of course, I gave you at the start of the program an opportunity to take action. I would encourage you to do so. But most importantly, even as you were listening to this story, you might have thought, I know somebody probably needs to know about this. I mean, I see some of these kids experimenting with drugs, and there seems to be, as Ashley points out, a resurgence in the interest of psychedelics. And somebody grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area where people were passing around LSD. I've seen that before, and we don't want to repeat. So this is just one more reason why we cover these issues. And if you can click on that button that says Give the Gift of Truth, we now have a matching challenge up to $125,000, which means your gift is matched dollar for dollar. You could give even right now by clicking on that button. Of course, you can give us a call offline, 800-347-5151. I want to thank Megan once again for her help engineering the program. Karen, thank you for stepping in for Steve, producing the program, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow with a Millennial Roundtable right here on Point of View.
Our nation is experiencing a major realignment right now. Political and cultural frameworks are shifting. Perhaps for the first time in a long time, some things are starting to shift in a positive direction. But as this political and cultural realignment takes place, another realignment is desperately needed, a realignment to God's Word. Data shows that few Americans' worldview is aligned with biblical truth, but you can help change that by partnering with Point of View, where God's truth comes first. When you support Point of View, every dollar you give ensures that a biblical perspective is accessible to listeners across the nation and around the world every day. Right now, every dollar you give will go especially far because every dollar you give through December will be matched up to $118,000. So give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topics, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate point of view. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.